So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاجبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش في ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقوق ملايين، حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم. خلصنا حقوق ملايين، حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا،
واسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده انتاجي وصنع ايديا.
واسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده انتاجي وصنع ايديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
واسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال.
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Холостяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the live stream going out on the 21st of November 2023 at 8 o'clock in the evening. So, tonight we're going to be covering the question of, is it all over in the Ukraine war, bar the shooting? And then moving on to the question of the war on Palestine, and more specifically, the question of the value of certain slogans, certain demands being raised, particularly in the imperialist countries, such as ceasefire now. So we're going to be talking about the value of that as a slogan, as a demand, as a thing to rally people behind, and what other slogans should communists actually be putting forward right now. So first of all, let us begin by looking at the discussion group, or the chat if you prefer. We have Muzzle Paint in there who says solidarity, and right back at you, James Graham, and we've got Rob and Beans in there too, and Banana Bender, good morning to you at the other end of the world. Lee, good evening to you, and Ian Foster, good evening to you. Good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade out in a bitterly cold Minsk apparently. Well, best get a whiskey in then, comrade. Carmo, good evening to you over on the probably less cold Wirral. Lord Charfield is here. DE, good evening to you. Oz, good day or good evening, good afternoon or good morning. CP says, what's the enchanting Arabic track? I believe that's a pan-Arab anthem that I've included. I'll need to check back. It's been a while since I put that compilation together. There's a pan-Arabic anthem that I put in the middle of it that you can find on YouTube. If I find it before the end of this broadcast, I'll put it in the chat, or you can find it easily on the Telegram group. Will Johnson, good evening, and good evening to Peter. And you join us tonight at a potentially momentous moment because, of course, the American imperialists have decided to send Lloyd Raytheon shareholder Austin out to Kiev to hold Zelensky's hand and tell him that the money is progressively drying up. At the same time, he's had a visit from the next applicant for the position of imperialism's stooge in chief. And that is, of course, Maya Sandu of Moldova, of whom more in the future episode, I'm sure. There has also been a recent visit, apparently, to Kiev done by the CIA director, William Burns, who, of course, many years ago, during the Obama administration, had actually been the U.S. ambassador to Russia. So a man with some considerable experience with regard to one of the countries in question here. And why are some of these big wigs going over there? Maybe not Sandu. I think Sandu's just there to show Zelensky greeting a foreign leader. If you look at the Zelensky presidency, and this is confirmed by Ukrainian Telegram channels, which seem to receive leaks from inside the Ukrainian government. So Legitimny is one of them. Resident is another one. Legitimny in particular always claim that Zelensky and Yermak, who is kind of spin doctor, power behind the throne kind of guy, are obsessed with optics over reality. And this is indeed true for the Zelensky presidency. It's about persistently presenting the image of great leader, victorious leader, colossus bestriding the world stage. So that's why you have an endless parade of dignitaries going to Kiev constantly to meet him. And now, though, it's more to sort of manage him into accepting what the US imperialists now want, though, of course, they're probably not going to get, which is that they want Zelensky to agree to some kind of, they call it the freezing of the conflict, and that's not just a reference to the turn in the weather. What the dominant faction in the White House now seems to favour, and forget what the Europeans favour, they're an irrelevance here. They, the majority opinion inside the White House, and also forget Biden, he doesn't even know what day it is. The US imperialists seem to be favouring the idea that they can put Ukraine onto the defensive, that they can somehow withdraw to or establish defensive lines that would enable them more easily to defend against the Russian armed forces, and essentially call it a draw without acknowledging that they've lost. Really. They've been talking about this since it became obvious by really the middle of June, just how badly the so-called counter-offensive was going, or offensive was going. And we've discussed this many times before, but any offensive which you advertise 6 months in advance, you tell the Russians exactly where it's going to go. You spend months telling them over and over again through official and unofficial media that it's going to go to Zaporozhye with the idea of a drive to Melitopol and then try and cut off Crimea. You tell them that about 1,000 times a day for 6 months, actually longer, 7 months, because they started talking about it in November of last year. Why on earth was anybody surprised that the Russians built an adequate defense, more than adequate defense, and actually annihilated the Ukrainian force that was sent against them? I mean, it's just the most extraordinary garbage, the way that they put this together. But it only makes sense if you regard Zelensky and his handlers as actually trying to prosecute a war. What they're trying to do, or what it's always been about, is trying to engineer regime change inside the Kremlin. And the more you explore the tactics of the Ukrainians throughout the war, the more you can see that the whole thing's been geared towards trying to trigger some sort of internal coup inside Russia. It's never been about, in reality, actually securing military victory on the battlefield for Ukraine. I don't think it's been about that anyway. I don't think, for instance, that General Zaluzny is stupid enough to believe the things that he said last year and at the beginning of this year about, well, if you give me enough men, I can beat the Russians. If you give me enough equipment, I can beat the Russians. I don't think he's stupid enough to believe that. I think he knows which side his bread is buttered, or at least he did at the last year and the beginning of this year, in that saying that and pretending that he could was what the various powerful people who were ultimately in charge of the budgets of Ukraine wanted to hear. Now, though, it's all blown up in his face and he's claiming that, oh, well, I didn't think that the Russians would continue fighting and I've been surprised by that. But basically, he knew very well that it wasn't going to work. So what was it all about? It was all about they thought that by doing this big attack towards Zaporozhye and showing enough progress that they were convinced that there would be some kind of chain reaction inside the governing circles of the Russian Federation, and that there would be a panic would set in amongst one faction or another inside the Russian Federation, and this would lead to the destabilizing and the potential removal of Putin. Now, let's just revisit this for a moment. Was this ever a realistic prospect? And my argument is no. It was perhaps a realistic prospect if this had been 2004, which, remember, I mentioned 2004, nearly 20 years ago now. That was, of course, the year of, the year of the Orange Revolution, the color revolution in Ukraine, the original color revolution that was meant to ultimately deliver what has been delivered now. That's what they were betting on with Yushchenko, that he would be able to deliver something akin to ultimately what was done there. But he wasn't able to do it for them. There wasn't enough organized brute violence available, and the Yushchenko regime wasn't as overtly fascist as the Maidan regime. Now, of course, he did redeem officially the reputation of Bandera and others, and did go towards it, but he wasn't in a strong enough political position to deliver the imperialists ultimately what they wanted in Ukraine. That took a coup and a whole new regime being built that was built on the foundations of fascist violence from the very beginning. So 20 years ago, if they'd have tried this, then they may have been right in that 20 years ago, Putin and the group in charge of the Kremlin were a lot less secure, perhaps, in their power. The faction that was completely comprador, that was completely tied to the West, that would do anything to retain its ability to sell assets or sell commodities to the West, principally oil and gas, to profit from that trade, to export capital out of the country, to buy properties in Western Europe, Britain, and the United States, to frequent all the bourgeois social high spots of Western Europe and the USA. 20 years ago, that group was a lot more strong. And so if this calculation had been made with relation to the Russia of 2003 to 2004, they may have had more of a reason to believe that some kind of shock defeat on a battlefield could lead to some sort of internal coup. But they were never going to get a shock defeat this time, and they certainly weren't going to get an internal coup. The closest anybody came was the Prigozhin events, and that certainly wasn't something that I don't think that the Western intelligence services knew much about going into it. There were a lot of allegations about Prigozhin and his ties to various different foreign organizations. I don't know enough about that to go into it for now, but certainly the thing we can safely conclude is that the calculations over the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the calculation it was going to induce panic and a potential removal of Putin inside Moscow, have all been proven to be completely erroneous. And so it's led to only mass death and destruction. For instance, the Russian Ministry of Defense were claiming that over the course of the last 3 weeks, something like 13,500 Ukrainians have been killed. And this is just around, I believe it's the Artyomovsk or Bakhmut area and the Avdiivka area, where the Russians have been slowly pushing through to root the Ukrainians out of this position in the land of the Donetsk People's Republic. So the counteroffensive, a disaster. The American imperialists, specifically those organized within what's called the Biden administration, but I'm not quite sure if it should be named after him anymore, but let's just call it that for reasons of simplicity. They've realized that now that they can't win. Their puppet is exhausted. It has lost, the Ukrainians have lost, depending upon which estimate you believe, 300,000 dead, maybe as many as 500,000 dead, perhaps as many as 1 million in total casualties, i.e. killed, wounded and prisoners, and defections, of course. So this is quite plainly something that now cannot be won. The attempt to revive the military-industrial bases of Western Europe has led to only failure. And it's just it's important to pause for a moment to examine why that is. The British government never made any serious attempts to expand the military-industrial production base in this country. They threw some money at it, but they didn't fundamentally change the business model that it's operated off for the last 20 to 30 years. The Germans promised all kinds of things. Schultz was talking about spending billions more on war spending. But now it's looking like that they're not going to do that. They keep saying that they are, but if they do that, then they're going to have to severely cut spending in other areas. And there's a recession coming in the Eurozone and all kinds of problems queuing up for the attention of the German Chancellor, who just happens to be probably the worst man to make these kind of decisions, which is, of course, Olaf Scholz, a weak and confused man who is completely unable to handle the realities that are being thrown at him, it seems. Irish Partisan comments, training of Ukrainian pilots on F-16s has begun in Denmark. Yes, I saw that. I don't think this is going to do them any good at all. I mean, the F-16 is an aircraft that was first designed in the 1970s. The Russian Air Force has had not just the last 30 years to study it, but the last 50 years to study it. It came into widespread usage in the American Air Force in the 1980s. So the Soviet Air Force studied it comprehensively. Now the Russians have got all that experience plus their own. I don't think the Ukrainians getting a few F-16s is going to make the slightest bit of difference, given the dramatic improvements in Russian air defense as well. But to return to the point about why Austin is in Kiev, he's there basically the same reason that Burns visited there, to tell the main players there that essentially that the road is coming to a close, that they are heading towards a stop sign or indeed a dead end, and that the time has come for them to reassess their priorities. Of course, Zelensky can't reassess. Zelensky can't suddenly turn around and go, you know what, we're just going to go on the defensive now, or we're going to open up the negotiations with the Russians, because the Russians won't negotiate with him, not anymore. They understand now the nature of the Kiev regime is that Zelensky, were he to suddenly engage in negotiations, would have no power to deliver upon anything. The real basis for the Kiev regime now is its authority as a wartime government and the violence of the organized fascist organizations that stand behind it. The other source of its authority is, of course, that Zelensky is viewed by these different players within the viper's nest of Kiev politics as being the man through whom the US operates. If he's no longer the man through whom the US operates, who can guarantee the largesse of the United States in terms of the large amounts of financial packages that keep the Ukrainian economy and state afloat, then his value to the different players in the Kiev viper's nest has disappeared. And so his life becomes more and more forfeit every single day. So he can't negotiate with the Russians. He doesn't have the power to do it. He doesn't have the ability to do it. And the Russians won't listen to him anyway. So quite how the US imperialists think that they're going to be able to get Zelensky to negotiate a deal with the Russians is beyond me. And if they're thinking of replacing him ultimately with somebody else, be it Zaluzny or the Zaluzny-Arestovich dream ticket, well, that's not going to work either. Because all of these men have had a long and discreditable history inside Ukrainian politics. And I think that the views expressed by Putin more subtly and Medvedev and Volodin of the Duma less subtly, with regard to the ultimate aims here, this is going to end up with the Russians saying to whatever authority exists in Kiev that you have to capitulate completely without any conditions. Oh, and by the way, we're taking Kiev off you as well, which I think they're going to do. And therefore, the plans of the American imperialists come too late. Had they decided this time last year, or in the immediate aftermath of that successful Ukrainian counteroffensive that was succeeded in September of last year, had they decided then that they would say to the Ukrainians, right, now you need to go dig yourself in, go on the defensive, freeze the conflict, then that might have stood a chance of succeeding. But again, they miscalculated. They miscalculated over the very soft position taken by the Russians early on, where, as we covered in that episode last week when we talked about the blocked negotiations, that the Putin government would have settled for essentially the removal of Luhansk and Donetsk from Kiev rule in practice, even if they might have been left in Ukraine on paper. It would have been the Georgian solution, basically, with regard to how Abkhazia and South Ossetia ruled. They would have been nominally in Ukraine, but for all intents and purposes, outside of it. They would settle for that. perpetual Russian control over Crimea being acknowledged, and then, of course, Ukraine not being in NATO, which, as I outlined last week, would have spelt curtains for Zelensky anyway, had he signed that. But now, when the US imperialists blocked that, of course, they opened up the road which we're on now. It would have been perhaps feasible to say that they were freezing the conflict in early October last year, maybe, but then again, they miscalculated. They kept mistaking the slow movement of the Kremlin towards mobilization and towards the amping up of war production. They kept mistaking the way in which the Kremlin moved at a relatively slow pace, which is the way in which the Kremlin system operates, the Putin system operates. They kept mistaking that for weakness and irresolution. And they kept thinking, engaging in massive amounts of wishful thinking, that if they just went for one more push, that the whole thing would fall apart. They thought that the September offensive last year was the Russian army falling apart. It wasn't true. The Russian army needed to fundamentally reorganize itself, bring in more men, re-equip them, build more forces, because they had tried to do the initial special military operation with a very limited number of men, and they hadn't even told the men whose contracts were up in August of last year that they should continue on. So a lot of men left the army. And that's why their great, bold offensive in September succeeded. It succeeded in pushing into areas where the Russians didn't have any men or had very, very few men. And yet the imperialists are so arrogant and so foolish that they actually thought that this was some kind of enormous success, just like they lied, and Zelensky lied about the Russian withdrawal from around Kiev and said, oh, this is a great victory, where in actual fact the Russian political leadership agreed to withdraw in order that it could be seen as a gesture of goodwill for the negotiations that were still ongoing then in Istanbul. So at each stage they've completely deluded themselves into thinking that it was Russian weakness on display, when in actual fact it was the system that Putin presides over and manages, I think is a better way of describing it, and has to produces a consensus at each stage that involves various different power players and power groups inside the Russian political organizations, and ultimately this reaches a conclusion, and it does so at its own pace, and a pace which it took me a while when trying to analyze this to get used to. But it did produce results, and it produces them in a way that is pretty relentless. And if you look at the way in which the tank production figures in Russia have slowly gone upwards, you look at the way in which the vast legacy inherited from the Soviet Union in terms of the war industries has been cranking up and cranking up and cranking up to the point now where they're completely outproducing the entire NATO bloc. And if you would have cared to examine this, if the imperialists would have cared to examine it, then they would have seen the flaw in their plans. But at this stage, they can't stop themselves. Magical thinking is what they've been engaging in for years domestically. So why would it be any different overseas? They've been engaging in magical thinking since at least, I would argue, probably it began in the aftermath of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR. The magical thinking there begins with the idea that they won the Cold War. They, as I've said before, they didn't win. The other side imploded due to internal contradictions and weaknesses. They fooled themselves into thinking that they'd won it, and then tried to act as if they were the great conquerors, where in actual fact they'd come pretty close to complete failure themselves at various points. And they papered over all the cracks in their system for a few more years. And 17 years after the failure of or the collapse due to restorationist or capitalist restorationist and revisionist tendencies in the Soviet leadership, the 17 years after that, you see the collapse of the imperialist system in practice form, in a rehearsal form, that ultimately then staggers on until now, another 15 years. And they keep getting more and more desperate as the system doesn't fix itself and keep engaging in more and more magical thinking. And so the magical thinking this time was that they could secure the collapse of the Russian government via their activities in Ukraine. And ultimately, at each stage, they fooled themselves and lied to themselves about the way in which things were going, about what would be needed to bring about a regime change operation inside Russia. And at each stage, they were wrong. At each stage, the leaders of the Western Bloc were engaging in completely fantastical, illusory thinking. But again, this is the system that they preside over now. Rational inquiries are not welcome, because even on if you rationally analyze the internal economic situation of the U.S. economy or the British economy, even not on the basis of Marxism, even, but just on the basis of being able to properly analyze the structural weaknesses involved, you'd see that the ballooning debts, the deteriorating nature of the internal economy, the way in which the internal consumer market in the West is heading towards a significant problem as more and more incomes get restricted. People will stop spending. The consumer economy is heading for a serious problem. There's no ability to rebalance the economy in another direction. So it always makes me laugh when you see like Peter Zeihan and others going on about, oh, China's really screwed now. China's got a huge real estate problem. So it's going to collapse the Chinese economy with regard to the Evergrande crisis. Of course, it was never going to collapse the Chinese economy. You know, we could end up where we've had a serious real estate problem, a housing problem in Britain for decades that shows no sign of being resolved. In fact, every time there's a property bubble that looks to go pop, the government promptly reinflates it again, or at least tries to. And so, again, another example of our projection. My point is that the enormous problems that the Western system has, it often projects onto its enemies, but it's unable to withstand an analysis internally of all these problems. And it's certainly not able to actually analyze these properly with regard to potential political changes, because it can't move politically or economically now. It's stuck. Any move that it makes to reform its system, even from the perspective of like pure bourgeois politics, threatens to derail everything. Now, what do I mean by that? You look at the example of Liz Truss, the late and unlamented, completely idiotic former foreign minister and prime minister in this country. She was thrown out the door, not because she didn't, go to the right school or shake hands the right way, but because the way in which she was, her and her Chancellor of the Exchequer, a guy called Kwasi Kwarteng, were pursuing economic changes, threatened to destabilize major pension funds in Britain. Now, I can go into an analysis of the British economy and its weaknesses in a future occasion. I'm thinking of doing that either next week or the week after. But even somebody coming from the bourgeois side, albeit from the slightly rogue elements in the Conservative Party, was drummed out because things have to remain absolutely as they are in order to keep the cycle of fake money and debt continuing. Otherwise, the British economy basically staggers to a halt. And hence why, of course, the British have been so desperate to pursue this war in Ukraine, and they can't change course now. So to go back to the question of the abandonment of Zelensky, the US has clearly decided that they need now, too late, to try and freeze this. The Russians aren't going to, of course. And so what is the likely outcome? The likely outcome is, as I have said before, that the US will not cut off aid to Ukraine completely. They will give enough to hold off a sudden collapse. They will try to keep this war going and costing the Russians in terms of blood and treasure as long as they possibly can. And the idea being that if they can just spin this out for another year and a half, get them through the US election cycle with this just sort of rumbling on in the background. And then hopefully it drops out of all headlines with the events that are going on inside occupied Palestine and elsewhere. And the US voting base doesn't really pay much attention to it. And it doesn't damage particularly the electoral prospects of... I mean, I still can't believe that Biden's going to run. I mean, the guy looks like a shuffling, shambling corpse. But whoever is on the Democratic ticket doesn't get damaged too badly by the fallout from this disaster. So the plan, I think, will be, from the US side, manage Zelensky out of the door at some point, get him into exile, appoint somebody who's going to be able to oversee a defensive war. They may still try Zaluzny. He's certainly not going to get any truck out of the Russians. The only thing they will accept from him is a surrender. And then hope that by throwing essentially every man and woman who can still walk onto the front line carrying a rusty AK-47, and by keeping the lights on for the Ukraine government, but slowly cutting down the amount of money and trying to pass the costs on to a now flailing and desperate EU, that the Americans can slip quietly out of the back door and hope that nobody inside the United States notices too much when this thing implodes, or when the Russian tricolor flies over Kiev. And that, to my mind, is the only thing that is the consensus position now inside the political machinery of US imperialism, to spin it out as long as they possibly can, but with the knowledge that this thing's going to basically go down now. And the only thing that they have on their minds is how that they can evade responsibility for it happening. They think that it's not going to be as damaging, for instance, as the war in Afghanistan coming to a conclusion, because there's going to be no scene of American troops scuttling out of an airport with former collaborators clinging to the wheels of an aircraft. They'll have moved most American forces that are there undercover out of Ukraine anyway. Those that are there fighting as mercenaries, well, a lot of them have left. A lot of them are dead. And those that remain have probably got an escape route planned. The Polish government has changed, and even though it's run by equally fanatical servants of American imperialism, there's no enthusiasm inside Poland, it seems, for fighting some kind of shooting war with the Russians. Even the likes of Donald Tusk aren't keen on that one. So the plan is to manage this into a point where, when the Russians take Kiev and Odessa and however much of the rest of the country they want, that the US internal population doesn't notice as much. That's the plan. They don't really care, the US that is, doesn't really care about the potential impact on Europe at this stage. All they're really bothered about is getting out of this. They would like to preserve the Kiev regime if they could, admittedly with somebody else at the head of it. But if they can't, what they'll do is, when the Russians take as much as they're going to take, they'll try and run an insurgency inside Ukraine again. They'll try and run a terrorist campaign. And then, if that doesn't work, then they'll dust their hands off and turn their attention elsewhere, maybe to China. But if that's possible, of course. Okay, comments in the chat. So DE says, have those F-16s been put through a recent MOT? Well, I would certainly hope so. I don't even know. I mean, the rumors keep circulating about the fact that they need to basically make the Ukrainians completely familiar with English before they can properly learn to fly these things. So, like, there's no... I mean, even if they installed, like, a new pilot's control system that was in Cyrillic, how is that even going to work? They need to understand English to properly work the plane, given that that's how that's the operating system it's built around, is in the English language. So I still don't understand how this is going to help them. But again, I think the F-16 thing was just an announcement to help Zelensky. I don't think it was ever meant to be some sort of serious thing. Certainly it's not something that the Russian Air Force is going to be particularly scared of. Irish Partisan says Moscow has no interest in negotiating with Kiev. What would they get from Zaluzny or any of Zelensky's successors? There's no incentive for the Kremlin anyway. Yeah, the time for negotiations is all gone. There's no way that the Russians can now accept anything other than unconditional surrender. As Volodin said. Ukrainian channel Strana reports UAVs heading towards Dnipropetrovsk tonight, says Irish Partisan. President Jesus says Peter Zeihan thinks he's discovered an opening in Russia's defences by analysing satellite data. So there's still a chance. Well, Peter Zeihan is he's running a great con. I'll say that for him. It's like if you're some sort of online con man, you can if you can get on Joe Rogan and use long words and make a lot of reference to the data. It's all in the data. I've discovered how the Chinese system is going to collapse. It's in the property sector. It's all in the data. You know, you can make a good career for yourself, like selling bullshit to Americans and British people who want to hear that there's a chance we could still win the war in Ukraine. There's a chance that China will implode without us having to do anything. And the popularity of people like Zeihan speaks to the internal desperation in U.S. imperialism that they, on one level, know very well that they can't fight China and win, economically or militarily. So they come up with like ludicrous solutions, like, oh, well, it's China is 6 months from collapse. I mean, they've been saying this. There's the old joke from that's been going around in meme form regarding the Economist magazine's predictions about how many times China will collapse since 1992. It's been like something like every other year that the Economist has said, China in trouble, China heading for the rocks, China going to collapse. Of course, it never does, because it's all just wishful thinking, and or they're basing it on like the opinions of some Chinese exiles or some Falun Gong guys they found playing a bongo drum set on Manchester High Street or something. It's just ludicrous wishful thinking that people like Zeihan just go around selling to people, but it's a good grift. I'm sure he's making lots of money doing it. Irish Partisan says the Duran said that DC will dump Ukraine and foster it on the Europeans to deal with. Well, they may try and do that. I think that's certainly something that the US will try and do. But the Europeans have no capacity to provide the level of cash injections that the Ukrainians require at the moment. Due to the way that the global economy is structured, the US can essentially continue writing blank checks for Ukraine, or at least very generous checks for Ukraine, to keep the lights on, keep the government ticking over, keep the economy from collapsing, underpin the hryvnia. The Europeans can't do that. I mean, the Europeans are faced with a growing and very substantial Eurozone debt crisis that's going to explode at some point very soon. And that's going to be something which isn't just going to be affecting the peripheral countries like Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Ireland again. It's going to be something which hits Germany itself. And without Germany, there is no EU. Just as without the US, there is no NATO. So if the Eurozone debt crisis comes back in a major way, and the euro becomes more and more untenable in terms of its continuation, and this is going to happen quite soon, how on earth is the EU going to underwrite the Ukrainian government? How? I mean, they could, of course, issue more and more euro bonds, racking up more and more debt, engaging in more complicated financial instrumentalization in order to get themselves out of this. But if the solution to this is like rack up more debt that's issued by the European Central Bank, I mean, this is an insane idea. But I wouldn't rule out the European Union leadership, which is principally, I mean, people say it's Ursula von der Leyen. In reality, the European Union leadership lies with the German ruling class. The question is, is there anybody, politically speaking, within the German ruling class who can call time on this? And ultimately, the question is, well, how long do they try and preserve the EU and the euro as a vessel? Now, 10 years ago, to digress briefly, when the Eurozone debt crisis first hit in a major way, there was talk of the German government having a backstop option to essentially reintroduce a version of the Deutschmark, which would be essentially a euro substitute for like Northern Europe. So that would be Germany, potentially France, but certainly Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, and maybe it would cover to a certain extent the Nordic countries, but mainly it would be those who are in the European single currency right now. Basically, it would mean that if things got desperate, that the Germans would cut off Southern Europe and have a renewed Deutschmark zone in Northern Europe. And that would be what they would try and salvage from the wreckage of the euro and the EU. That's kind of gone on the back burner. But there was a lot of talk of that 10 years ago. But essentially, the problem hasn't gone away. And if they're going to try and underwrite Kiev, well, that's another enormous burden on an already overstretched and debt-burdened, debt-laden system. So I can't see this working at all. If the German ruling class approve of that idea, then, again, it seems suicidal. But, again, none of their options here are good. Like, for the American imperialists can just about feasibly walk away from the Ukraine crater that they've caused and not suffer immediate consequences. They are already suffering consequences, though, in terms of the world has seen that they were afraid of fighting the Russians directly and that their proxies have been destroyed and that the Russians are not just winning, but they will win far more than even the most fervent Russian nationalist would have believed a year ago or 18 months ago. And the world has seen all of that. And they've also seen the impotence of the Europeans. I strongly believe that whereas the coups in like places like Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger were a response to internal conditions and contradictions, they have been influenced in the way that they've acted by the visible weakness, particularly of French imperialism, which has been revealed to be completely impotent now. And so the Nigerians and the rest of the countries in the Sahel in former French Africa have observed this and have acted accordingly. So Europe as a body, as the European Union, is heading for the rocks quicker than a pirate ship with a drunk captain at the helm. So if the Americans then turn around and say, Ursula, it's yours now, this project in Ukraine. Make sure you keep it afloat for another 6 months. I'm sure von der Leyen, as a very loyal servant of American imperialism, would try her best to do it. But I just think that there's too many problems facing the Eurozone. The debt crisis is too big. The problems which they deferred from 10 years ago by attacking the living standards of the Greek, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Irish working classes, those problems didn't go away. They were just deferred for a few more years, and now they're all coming back again. So the idea of the EU keeping Ukraine afloat is, frankly, it's fanciful. It wouldn't surprise me if the US tried to do it, but it's fanciful to believe that it would work. But perhaps the American imperialists don't really need it to work. They just need it to look as if it's going to work for about 6 months. And perhaps that's all they're looking for. So, Mohammed asks, opinions on Saddam Hussein? Well, rather long question. I'll do my best to shorthand the answer. I think the Ba'athist government, and it's important to call it that, because it wasn't just about Saddam Hussein. Of course, he was the president. He was the man who was killed by the US imperialists. The thing about the Ba'athists, and this is true to a certain extent of Syria as well, but let's focus on Iraq, is that they were a mixed bag. On the one hand, you can't deny that the period of Ba'athist rule, particularly in the 70s and even in the 80s, even with all the damage that the war with Iran did, there were some genuinely progressive achievements in Iraq during the period of Ba'athist rule. There was serious attempts at industrializing the country. There was an expansion of the scientific and technical base of the country and the educational achievements of the Ba'athist era. There was progressive advances for women, for instance. There was the removal of some of the influence of religious obscurantism. And the country was formally defined under its 1970s constitution as being a socialist country, be on the socialist model and development model. So all of that, has to be said, is like the Ba'athist period produced many progressive results for Iraq, and its destruction has only resulted in negative things, negative outcomes. Even in the diminished form that the Ba'athist government survived in post-1991, thanks to, of course, the siege laid upon Iraq by the American imperialists, it was still running things better than any of its successors that had been either imposed by the American imperialists or which grew out of the messy compromises that the American defeat and withdrawal, partial withdrawal from Iraq has produced. And so for a figure like Saddam Hussein, it's important to judge in a balanced fashion. Now, I've said that there were significant achievements there that must be properly understood and appreciated and always acknowledged. The Ba'athists also had some very, very bad weaknesses. Now, part of that comes from the fact that Ba'athism in Iraq and in Syria, whilst it did have mass support, it was a movement that often had its base within like free officers movements, supported by like layers in the army, and that was where its base was. It was not a mass movement that was based on a mobilization of the working class and peasantry. It was not a movement that was rooted in the mass participation of the working class and peasantry in the government of the country. It was ruled by a relatively small group inside Iraq, albeit a group which, again, had some progressive achievements to its name. And the masses were not mobilized in the way that a communist country would have done to defend it. And that led to a lot of weaknesses. And those weaknesses were cruelly exposed with the war against Iran and the war the war over Kuwait, which admittedly was largely cooked up by the American imperialists to demonstrate a point about the New World Order. But I think the leadership of Saddam Hussein, whilst I have to applaud the very brave way that he faced his execution by the imperialists, it's certain that he and his government made a number of mistakes certainly in the 1980s, and were subject to manipulations by imperialism as well. Philbin says, comrades from Rhode Island, USA, recent poll of Iraqis has about 60% of them agreeing the country was far better off during Ba'ath Party administration. Can confirm we destroyed something progressive. Yeah, there's no doubt, as I said, that the Ba'athist government was genuinely progressive in a lot of important ways. And the way in which it was characterized in the run-up to the invasion was just fucking ludicrous. Like, it should be emphasized again, though. The Ba'athists committed a number of criminal acts. They did gas the Kurdish population in Halabja. They did oversee the execution of a lot of Iraqi communists as well in the 1970s. They were in coalition. Then the Ba'athists turned on them and executed a load of them. They did have a relationship with US imperialism, that whilst it was not it was not the case that Saddam was a CIA agent or anything like that. They were in the non-aligned movement. They did have a relationship with imperialism. The imperialists did try to manipulate them, as they tried to manipulate the Iranian side as well. So let's be clear-eyed about the Baathists in Iraq and in Syria, for all that we should continue to defend the government of Syria on the grounds that it is, on the whole, a progressive government, and certainly one that is going to defend the sovereignty and independence of Syria, and is a hell of a lot better for the Syrian masses than whatever nightmarish Frankenstein-type creation that the imperialists would have put together. But that was a government that had made serious mistakes, that had sold out liberation struggles in the past, in the 1980s, that had many corrupt elements to it. And still, we defended as the more progressive alternative, given what was being done to Syria, and will continue to defend it from assault by imperialism on the grounds that it is, on balance, the much more progressive alternative. But you should always be clear-eyed about what these different movements and parties are. So, right, Mahmoud Saad asks, do you think that Iran is responsible for much of the Middle East problems? No, I don't. Why do you define the Yemeni liberation movement as a problem, Mahmoud Saad? Why do you Hamas aren't exactly a problem either? If you can clarify your question, because it sounds like you're taking a pro-imperialist position there, given the way you've worded it. If that's not what you intended, then let me know in the comments. James Graham says, we thought in the 70s that Iraq was going socialist. Well, that's certainly what they said in the Constitution. The reality, I think, was a little bit more mixed. Philbin says, Saddam on Ba'ath communist relationship. The same trench, not opposing sides. Well, good quote, not actually true, given the Baathists did turn on the Iraqi Communist Party and killed a lot of them. Again, I would still defend the Ba'athist government in Iraq right up to the point and during the invasion of Iraq by the imperialists. It was, even with the undoubted mistakes and even crimes that it committed, it was still something that was worth backing. And it should have been the case that more people were prepared to full-throatedly defend its progressive achievements in 2003 and earlier in 1991. Jonah says, have you heard the argument that the long-term effects of the former one-child policy will cause population collapse and doom China? Yeah, I've seen Peter Zahan say that. I don't think it's true. I think that there'll probably be like some issues related to it with regard to like unevenness in population growth. It was certainly it was certainly a bad idea, but the idea it's going to lead to collapse is ridiculous. Iran is supporting all types of conflict in the Middle East, prolonging them. No, you're wrong. It's the Yemen war, which Ansar Allah grew out of and in response to, was prolonged by the imperialists through their proxies in Saudi Arabia. The prolonging, as you put it, of the conflict in Iraq itself is a direct result of the occupation of the imperialists. Hamas is a liberation movement that is designed around, that is all arisen in response to Israeli/US occupation of Palestine. Your perspective is completely and utterly incorrect. You're blaming Iran for things which are being done by US imperialism. And so because you're an imperialist sympathizer, I'm going to essentially block you and tell you to fuck off, because you can go and watch the BBC. Right, moving on from there. We are hitting the top of the hour, and I haven't even had time to consider the question of the slogans yet. So I think we'll come to that tomorrow. Got diverted into a discussion of Baathism by some imperialist plant in the chat. Always interesting when they turn up. Right, I am going to leave it there for tonight because I have to get on with various other things. We will be back tomorrow. It'll be 8 o'clock at the same time. Any imperialist plants that want to come into the chat again, feel free to do so. I will answer your points as patiently as I can. Then I will kindly invite you to go fuck yourself and go and watch the BBC. Right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you to everybody who contributed to a very active chat tonight. And I'll be back again at the same time tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again.